couple decades now, and focusing on downtown, and revisiting downtown, and revisiting some of our other neighborhoods. And it's been really gratifying to see that as these studies are done, we can actually implement and see some of the forecast of growth and forecast of the market actually show up, which is really nice. And we expect the same thing to happen with this study. Just as a brief background, one of the things that we did a little differently with this analysis is that we not only are updating the downtown plan and revisiting some of the southeast portions of the city, but we also took a look at neighborhood areas that encircle our downtown. So we're really looking at the core of the city and trying to understand, again, sort of competitive position of some of these different neighborhoods, understand what opportunities there are for placemaking and really strengthening the market across the city and looking into new market areas, different market areas. And so, tonight we're going to be focused on 2 of the zones. We created these 7 zones. We're going to be focusing tonight on zones B and C, which are sort of near southeast areas. And but these other 7, the remaining zones, are also available on our city's website for review. And another thing that we did was we asked Laurie to take a look at Allen County as a whole and the city as a whole from a market perspective to provide context for what the potential is in these different zones that we're studying. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background. We keep expanding the idea of how we're doing these housing market studies. Let me introduce our star of the show. Laurie Volk is the principal in charge at Zimmerman Volk Associates. They do market studies like this and others for many, many communities. She's the firm's primary analyst of demographic, market, and lifestyle trends. Their target market methodology and analytical tools, they look at market potential for downtown housing, for mixed income housing, mixed tenure, repopulation, and stabilization of fragile inner-city neighborhoods, and for a few mixed-use, pedestrian-oriented and traditional neighborhoods. New mixed-use, pedestrian-oriented traditional neighborhoods. And it's been instrumental in bringing Zimmerman Volk Associates into national prominence. This is a unique way of looking at the housing market. It's not your typical supply and demand equation. Laurie with her team has conducted more than 100 downtown studies across the country in cities ranging from Utica, New York, to Detroit, Michigan. And with that, I will turn it over to Laurie. Thanks again for being here and being interested in Fort Wayne's housing market.
Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. I have to tell you that this is my first in-person presentation since the start of the pandemic. I've made about 20 presentations in the past year and a half via Zoom, and this Fort Wayne gets me for the first time in the flesh. And I'm wondering, I hope I remember how to do this in real life instead of on Zoom. I'm delighted to be here. I had so hoped that I would be able to make these presentations in person because I have a special fondness in my heart for Fort Wayne. The first time I was here was in 2006, and that's 15 years ago, and I've been back and forth over the years, and I've gotten to know the city very well. And I really like the city. I love the people here. You've made this a very dynamic city, and it's rising in national prominence. And I hope that this study helps each of these individual neighborhoods to achieve even more development and more housing that appeals to 21st century market. This study is, as Paul said, going to be focused on what we call zones B and C, which essentially make up Southeast Fort Wayne. The photograph is a picture of kids playing at the Jennings Recreation Center, which is in Southeast, and it is the oldest community center in the city of Fort Wayne, and that's in Zone B. As Paul said, this has been a very large and comprehensive study. We started back in March, but it actually took about 6 months just to decide what we should be focusing on and into what depth of detail. We looked at Allen County as a whole, the city of Fort Wayne as a whole, and then these 7 individual study areas. Now, if you can see, study area Zone A, green, is downtown, and B and C are the study areas that we are focusing on tonight. D is even further south from Zone C, and E, F, and G are the other sides of downtown Fort Wayne. I wanted to talk a little bit about how we do these studies, because as Paul mentioned, we don't use conventional supply-demand analysis. We learned a long time ago that in cities that are struggling, or neighborhoods that are struggling, losing population instead of gaining it, when you're projecting household change, it's typically negative. And banks, for some reason, think it's odd to finance a project in an area that's losing population. They figure, well, you're losing population. Why should we finance that project? And if there's nothing really happening in terms of new development, that even makes the case harder for developers. So we decided we needed a new approach to market housing, how to understand who's actually comprising the market for new housing in a given area. So we realized that the best way to do it was actually not to look at demand or supply-demand, but to look at potential, because every neighborhood has potential. And that's because potential is based on household mobility. And if you can understand who those households are who are moving, where they're moving from, where they're moving to, what their housing preferences are, what their financial capabilities are, you can understand what kind of housing should be developed in order to attract those people. So that's what we've done over the years, is developed and refined this methodology. And we've found it to be a very, very powerful indication of market. And we work all over the country because in many cities, it's very difficult to determine what you should do because those are cities that are really struggling. So these are the steps that we go through. First, we analyze where the potential market currently lives. How many of those people would be likely to move to the Southeast and who they are, both in terms of life stage, whether they're younger, older, singles, or couples, or whether they're a family, what kind of housing they're looking for. Are they looking for single-family houses, rental apartments? And what kind of choice do they have in that given area today? Then we look at affordability. And in this study, we are looking not just at market rate. And here in Fort Wayne, market rate for rental housing is approximately 80% of the AMI and above. And what we're looking at is 60 to 80% of the AMI for what we would call affordable or workforce housing. And market rate would be 80% and above. And then finally, we look at how many of those households that are moving every year you could capture. And that would give you an idea of how quickly these units would be absorbed. So here is a bigger map of Southeast Fort Wayne Zone B. You're going to see it extends all the way up from the river down to Paulding at the very bottom. And it's a large study area, but all of these are approximately the same size in terms of population and households. It covers a lot of different neighborhoods ranging from Renaissance Point down to Suburban Heights. Study area Zone C fits together with Zone B. It's just further south, and it actually occupies the rest of the city in the southeast, most of it anyway, that's not in Zone D, between Paulding and Oxford down to Tillman. So the first thing we wanted to understand when we were doing this study is how large is that southeast Fort Wayne housing market? And based on that methodology that I just told you about, we were looking at where people were coming from and how many would be likely to move to these two individual study areas. And the annual market potential, and what we do is what we projected out over 5 years, and then we average it out, because one year may be lower than the other, and that just makes it very confusing. So it's a lot easier for people to understand if we just average the 5-year total out per year. And per year, over the next 5 years, approximately 1,935 households represent the annual potential market who would be looking for housing, both new and existing, in Zone B. Zone C turned out to have a larger, significantly larger market potential of 2,850 households. Now, I can't explain to you exactly why that is, other than that there are more households currently living in Zone C, but we have these algorithms that capture all the different types of households that are living and moving to each of these study areas, and are able to winnow down to the key households that represent the really strong market potential for new and existing housing in those study areas. So combined, the Southeast represents just under 4,800 households per year that have the potential to move either within those study areas or to those study areas from the rest of the city, from the balance of the county, and from elsewhere. And this shows you the percentage of those, how those households break out in terms of where they're moving from. In Zone B, 72% of that market are households already living in the city of Fort Wayne, whereas in Zone C, that drops down to 67%. Now, that doesn't mean that it's fewer households, it's a share, it's a percentage. And the difference is, in study area Zone C, it's closer to the county, and there are more county households moving up into Zone C from that balance of the county. And so that Allen County represents over 9% of that annual potential market in Zone C, compared to just under 4% in Zone B. The rest of the percentages are roughly the same, but I found that was rather remarkable, that there are a greater number of households that are looking at housing in study area Zone C from people who are currently living in the county. So what we did was then look at what the housing preferences were of all of those individual households, and we aggregated them and then broke them out by housing type. And 44% of all of the households that represent the annual potential market in Zone B would be looking for rental apartments. That drops down to 42% in Zone C. And the difference is primarily in the preference for single-family detached houses. There is a smaller percentage of the market in Zone B looking for single-family detached houses than in Zone C. That may be due to the fact that there's more single-family already in Zone C. There are a lot of reasons, a lot of variables that go into the choices that people make. But it definitely shows that there is a definite market for rental properties, and that is one of the big issues, I think, in the Southeast is that there are very few rental properties that are well managed and really take care of their residents. A lot of the rental is single-family detached houses, a lot of them owned by absentee owners, and they're not well kept up. And that can be an issue for everybody in the neighborhood. So who is that market? We look at the market potential by life stage, because we know that depending upon what stage of life you're in, you're going to have very different preferences for the kind of housing you want to live in. And it's been traditional over the years that most families choose single-family houses because they want the independence of living in a single unit, and they want typically a backyard for their kids to play in. Although in many cases, the kids never have anything to do with playing in the backyard. So families are a plurality of the market in both Zone B and Zone C. And they are a mix of traditional and non-traditional families. And this is a differentiation that we had to understand about the market many years ago as families broke apart and were no longer that traditional family of mom, dad, 2 kids and a dog in a single family house with a white picket fence around it, that families were actually far more diverse. You can have single moms and single dads taking care of their kids, grandparents taking care of their kids, siblings. The range of family households now is incredibly diverse. So it's very important to understand that we have as many non-traditional households, families in the market across the United States, not just Fort Wayne. Empty nesters and retirees are the second largest market, about 36% in Zone B and 33% in Zone C. Now this market is mostly older couples, a lot of whom have retired, but many of whom are still working and are still having a hard time making ends meet. We found that affordable housing for seniors is a key issue for these 2 study areas. And finally, the smallest market for new housing and existing housing in B and C are what we call younger singles and couples. And a lot of these young people are just starting out. The current new generation out there we call iGen. They're younger than the millennials, and they have entered the housing job market at probably a worse time than the millennials did. The millennials entered in the crash. The poor iGen are entering during the pandemic. And so trying to find jobs in an office is next to impossible. And so many of them are finding work in the gig economy, which has not got a lot of stability, and it's not particularly well paying. So trying to get housing that young people can afford has become a key issue across the United States. Young people are the vitality of neighborhoods, particularly of downtowns, and study area B is what we would call an in-town neighborhood, very much affected by what happens in downtown. And it's very important to be able to provide housing for young people that they can actually afford on the incomes that they make. So the next question is, what kind of choices do people have? And we surveyed about 22 rental properties around the city, just a few in each study area. And looking specifically in study areas Zone B and C, the Bottle Works recently opened, and that is a wonderful property. In study area Zone C, we have New Waterloo Gardens, but there are very few actual properties of any size that are managed and well managed that really is what a lot of the market is actually looking for today. And current rents in the Southeast range from about $450 to $1,000 a month. And a lot of those rents are single family detached houses. The largest unit we saw was a house 1,500 square foot, 3-bedroom. And when you're only paying $1,000 a month, the landowner, the building owner, is not going to take a lot of care of that property. Elsewhere in the city, but we focus more on east and southeast, we have general rent ranges of $450 to $3,500. Now that $3,500 is in the northern part of Fort Wayne. We have the Lake Forest apartments, and we have a whole development of single-family detached rental housing. Now these are going to be extremely well managed, and this is a trend that has burgeoned in the last couple of years across the country as more and more financial institutions, stock market hedge funds, and unsavory characters from Wall Street have gotten involved in developing single-family rentals across the country. Outside of the Southeast, the rent sizes are, the unit sizes range from 500 to 1,800 square feet, so a lot larger than most of the units that you find in the Southeast. So, how about for sale housing? And we have very much to thank Upstar, particularly Joe Gugelman, who compiled data on every single study area of all the sales that took place in each of these study area zones over the last 5 years, from 2016 to 2020, and he produced maps to show me where they all were. So there were 583 sales over that 5-year time frame in Zone B, and 810 sales in Zone C. And here are 2 houses that sold over that time frame in Zone B. The general price range of all the units those units that sold in Zone B was $2,500 for obviously a house that was not in good condition, to $142,000, which was a very solid house in good condition. Ranged in size from 700 square feet for a 2-bedroom house to 2,500 square feet. And the price per square foot ranged from $2, obviously that's that $2,500 house, to $118 a square foot. Now it's very difficult for developers to build houses at much below $100 a square foot. As a matter of fact, I don't think they can do it today, what with rising land values, rising construction costs, and rising costs of labor. In Zone C, we had a price range of sales from $8,000 to $350,000. And you can see that the $350,000 house is that one on Bower Avenue. It's very large and obviously commanded the highest price over that 5-year time frame. And the price per square foot ranged between about $6 to $148 per square foot. You can see it is higher than in Zone B, and that's because a lot of the housing in study area Zone C is newer than study area Zone B. And unfortunately, a lot of times, no matter how beautiful an older house is, it doesn't have the physical amenities that today's market's looking for. It may have just 1 bathroom, no closets. You have to put in armoires to hang up your clothes. And often it's just limited to a very small bedrooms and a living room, and possibly an eat-in kitchen. So that's one reason why new construction is so important in these study area zones. It will help attract more and more people to live here in these neighborhoods. Housing affordability, as I mentioned at the beginning, does continue to be a challenge in the city, in these study areas, and across the country. And how we determine housing affordability is based on what HUD submits every year as the median family income for a family of 4. And that's for the Fort Wayne MSA, which is actually Allen County and a couple of surrounding counties. And they determined that that median family income in 2020 was 71.1. Now we use 2020 because when we started this study, the HUD hadn't come out with the 2021 data. Well, in July, they came out with the 2021 data, and it had only gone up to 71.7. And when you actually get to the calculations, it didn't make much difference. So we decided it was not worth redoing the thousands of tables that we had already done. So what does this mean? What we did then, and what HUD provides, are affordability based on a percentage of that area median income. So this chart shows you that if you are at 60% of the AMI and you're a single person, you just live by yourself, that income is $29,900. And then if you're, as your income goes up, 80% of AMI is just under $40,000, and 100% of the AMI, this is all for a single person household, is just under $50,000. So we use those numbers to help us understand how the market breaks out in terms of how many households have incomes that fall between 60 and 80%, because the households vary in size from one person, there's couples, there's 3, 4, 5-person households. So we've got a whole mix of both households in different sizes at different incomes that put them into different categories. So it gets pretty complicated. But we have a brilliant person in our office who has made all this into algorithms and macros, so it's become doable. So what we look at when we look at those numbers is households typically who earn below 30% of the area median income typically cannot afford any kind of housing that's available except for the least expensive. And it's usually where public housing is provided for those households. And they typically pay no more than 30% of their annual income for rent. 30 to 60% AMI is generally the range of incomes that low-income housing tax credits, which developers can get to help build those units, and that works for rental housing. And if there's an effort to actually try to encourage ownership housing, it would have to be incredibly deeply subsidized. So what we are focusing on in our study is 60 to 80% AMI, because that's where new workforce rental fall, and that's where subsidized ownership falls. It's highly unlikely that people with incomes between 60 and 80% AMI have saved the money for the down payment and can afford the mortgage and taxes and interest and utilities. So there's some subsidy required. 80 to 100% AMI in this case is market rate rentals, the lower end of market rate rentals, and subsidized home ownership. And above 100% AMI is market rate housing. So I know that's very complicated, but this is how we use federal data to understand how the market breaks out in terms of affordability, because we don't want to overestimate or underestimate households in any of those given categories. So when we looked at the 512 annual potential renters who had incomes at 60% AMI and above, this is based on paying no more than 30% of their income for rent and utilities. This is how they fell across the rent ranges that they could afford. And you can see that almost half of the market, 46%, have incomes that enable them to afford rents between $750 and $1,250 a month. And those people, the 7% who can afford rents above $1,750 a month, those are very well-to-do people. And we were really trying to focus on the heart of the market, because developers don't seem to have any trouble at all building housing for people at that $1,750 a month rent. What they have trouble building is housing for people who can only afford $750 to say $1,500 a month rent. We looked at the same thing in terms of the condominium buyers. There were, on average, every year, 67 annual potential condominium buyers. This time, we calculated their incomes based on having a 10% down payment, a 4% interest rate, and then the ability to pay the mortgage on the balance over the 30-year time frame, and with paying no more than 30% of their income for the mortgage, taxes, and utilities. And you can see that it's tied between under $150,000 and $200,000 to $250,000 in terms of where the market falls. Obviously, in the condo buyers, there were more 2- and 3-person households, which tended to have 2 incomes, which enabled them to afford a little more than they would have if they were single-person households. But that applies across the board to the ownership. There were 117 annual potential townhouse buyers with incomes at or above 60% AMI. And here, the heart of the market is 41% between $150,000 and $250,000. I talked to a number of real estate brokers at the beginning of this study, and a lot of them talked about $150,000 to $300,000 being the sweet spot of the for sale market. They were really referring to detached houses, but I think townhouses would be just as successful if we had developers who could produce them at those prices. Townhouses have not been very frequently built here. The most recent ones are in downtown, and they were highly successful. They were also very expensive because they're right next to the ballpark. We're talking about less expensive townhouses that young people can actually afford. Same thing with the detached house buyers. They're on average every year over the next 5 years, 543 annual potential buyers of detached houses with incomes at or above 60% AMI. And again, that same sweet spot is $150,000 to $250,000 for detached houses in Zone B. So, based on all of those numbers that we looked at, where everybody, 1-person, 2-person, 5-person households, where they were, we determined what the rents and prices should be for the workforce component of this study. And for households earning between 60 to 80% AMI, we recommended rental apartments with rents ranging from $550 to $1,150 a month, for studios to 3-bedroom units sized 500 to 1,350 square feet, and that works out to about 84 cents to $1.10, which is low. And you know, it's, as I said, prices keep going up of labor, land, construction, so that's going to be a challenge. Condominiums, we price between $135 and $160 for 2- and 3-bedroom condominiums. Townhouses, $145,000 to $190,000, and detached houses, $150,000 to $210,000. Now, on all of these, we would expect that we're going to have some involvement of nonprofits or some kind of structure to help people who have the income to pay the mortgage and the taxes, but not the down payment. Particularly young people can afford the mortgage, but unless they have very nice parents who will lend them the money for the down payment, they cannot afford to buy because they just can't muster $10,000 for a down payment. So that's Zone B workforce rents and prices. The market rate rents and prices, which correspond to households earning 80% AMI and up, the rent and price points are higher, not dramatically higher. Rents ranging from $850 to $1,800 for studios to 3 bedrooms, which are slightly larger, and $1.24 and $1.58 per square foot. That's getting more into the range where developers say, okay, we can come in and we can do that. You don't have to subsidize it. What we would like to see is mixing incomes, that it shouldn't just be, here is a property that's being developed for household that's between 60 to 80% AMI, and here's for the market rate folks. We think that most communities, most neighborhoods are strongest when there is a diversity of housing type, a diversity of housing, a diversity of people who live there. Those are the strongest neighborhoods we see. The condominiums, 175 to 250, townhouses 210 to 275, and detached houses 235 to $300,000. That's the market rate component. So then we move on and did the same thing with Zone C. So there were a slightly larger number of renters, 727 average per year, but you can see that it still tends to cluster at the low end of the rent ranges. There's 20% at $1,000 to $1,250, 18% $1,250 to $1,500, and the bulk of it is there $750 to $1,250. 96 annual potential condo buyers, and this is all over the place. It's hard to make any clear sense of why 150 to 200,000 has slightly smaller number of potential buyers. It just is how the household size and the incomes fell. And the calculations, we don't exaggerate or push. We try to reflect exactly what it is. 170 annual potential townhouse buyers. And there it's very clear the strength of the market is, again, 150 to 250 with this considerable market going on up to 300,000. And then detached house buyers, we have 2/3 of the market, 150 to 300,000. Corresponding to what all those realtors told me. They knew exactly what they were talking about. They experience it every day in sales. It came out, I was stunned to see how it just followed what they said, and we did not rig this. This is how it turned out. So in terms of workforce rents and prices, it's approximately the same rent range, slightly larger units because the households are slightly larger in study area Zone C, slightly larger units, but the price points are comparable to the same price points in Zone B. And the market rate goes up a little higher, and that's because there is a bit more developable land in study area Zone C. And obviously, if you can acquire more land and you have more units that you can market, you can afford to price them at a wider range. So finally, how fast will those units lease up? How fast will those units sell? What we do is we use capture rates of that annual potential market. A lot of firms forecast absorption, and to me that seemed like guesswork. We have found over the 33 years that we've been doing these market studies that for rental apartments, if you can capture 10 to 12% of those renter households that are moving every year, and for new construction, that it will actually happen. You can actually do that. 5 to 7.5% of the annual potential market for condominiums and townhouses, and 2.5 to 5% of the annual potential market for detached houses. So what does that work out to? A lot of numbers. It just 33 to 45 workforce units per year over the next 5 years, and you can see how it breaks out between Zone B and Zone C. Slightly higher numbers in Zone C, but you have a total of 14 to 18 of rental and sales in Zone B, and 19 to 27 in Zone C, which comes to that total of 33 to 45 units per year. And that was the workforce side. From the market rate size, that comes to 149 to 207 market rate units per year. And you can see 60 to 83 in Zone B as a sum of the rental, the condo sales, the townhouse sales, house sales, and 89 to 124 in Zone C, for a total of 149 to 207 market rate units a year. So now we're actually getting into a sizable number of units. If you can actually do that, if you can actually achieve those capture rates, you will create 910 to 1,260 total new units over the next 5 years in Zones B and C. 165 to 225 of them would be new workforce units. 745 to 1,035 would be new market rate units. That would have a significant impact on how these two neighborhoods feel and how the market would respond in the future. So the residential mix of those 910 to 1,260 units is predominantly rental apartments, 620 to 740, 45 to 60 condominiums, 70 to 105 townhouses, and 175 to 355 new single-family detached houses. So, how do you get this done? Especially in terms of creating mixed income housing, which I think is very important to think of when you're thinking of these two zones. There is the policy that many cities have adopted, but I know it's a very difficult one, and a lot of cities have struggled with it, is inclusionary zoning, which is asking, you notice I'm saying asking, not requiring, developers to include affordable units, a certain percentage of affordable units, in a market rate rental project. It's typically done with rental housing. That percentage can range from 5%, that's what Boston sets aside, to all of them. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, they're requiring new properties over a certain size to be all affordable. And not just tax credit, but the whole range of affordable. So it's something that a lot of cities debate, and while they understand that it is a good policy, it's often not achievable because people aren't ready to be required or even asked to provide a certain percentage of affordable units. Actually in North Carolina, a city is not allowed to pass such a regulation. So I don't know what the situation is here in Indiana, but it is something that I think you can get a lot done by discussing it, whether you do it or not. Mortgage assistance, as I mentioned, is going to be key for buyer households who don't have the down payment. And it's kind of sad that nowadays young people that used to be at this stage of their lives, I just read this in the New York Times last week, baby boomers, about 30% of baby boomers had already bought their first house and were already on the road to moving up, acquiring more and more housing value. Millennials, only 3% of all millennials today are in that situation. And that means that millennials are going to have a much harder time amassing any kind of family wealth. And so that's one reason why home ownership is on everybody's tongue nowadays. We've got to get people more into home ownership, and sometimes the only way to do it is to get nonprofits, charities, whatever you can do, set up funds to provide that mortgage assistance for households who have the money to pay the mortgage but don't have the down payment. Community land trusts and housing cooperatives are also ways of organizing the ownership of land, in the case of the community land trust. And that essentially is a nonprofit corporation buys up land and takes it out of the market. So it doesn't become, it doesn't get into the escalation of values. And they can keep the land value down, which keeps prices and rents of people who live on that land reasonable. And a housing cooperative is not very popular outside of New York City. I happen to own a co-op in Brooklyn, and the way it works is you don't own your unit, you own shares in a corporation. And the nonprofit corporation tends to everything. And I think it's a pretty reasonable way of doing things. New York City is outrageous, but we do know that there are cooperatives in other cities that work for very low income households. So all of these, and I'm sure there are dozens more, are ways that we need to think about creating mixed income, diverse, walkable neighborhoods in study area zones B and C. And that's the end of my presentation. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Anyone?
I have a question. A couple slides back, you've shown the capture rate. What is the capture rate for workforce housing?
It's the same for market rate as it is for workforce.
My question is, what does that capture rate that you discovered, how does that compare to other Midwest metros that you've done studies for?
I use that throughout Indiana. We're doing a lot of work in Indiana and have done for the last 5 years. And that's our pretty standard. It's actually pretty standard wherever we go. The issue is for workforce, whether people actually qualify. Before the pandemic, I was in Charlotte, and they're building a new rail line, and one of the things they want to make sure of is that there is a sufficient supply of affordable housing that's built along with the market rate. And somebody questioned me about the capture of the affordable. And I said, why? And he said, oh, well, this such and such project opened, and there was a line, 1,000 people waiting to get in. And I said, well, how many of them were actually qualified? And unfortunately, I mean, in some cities, the situation is really desperate. And if there's the people will try whether they qualify or not. So, yes?
I understand that, are you saying that in the B and C, we're really not going to get a subdivision type concentration of new built single family homes? Likely. And that likely what we should do is to try to concentrate infill development for that new single family homes.
Yes. I mean, there are parcels available and there are various developments underway. I mean, that one project is, rental single family. the land, acquisition of land is usually the big challenge in what we call these inner ring neighborhoods. Study Area C has more available land than B. B had Renaissance Point, which, as you know, that was totally torn down and new housing built there. And that's had a checkered past, mainly because of various things that happened in the national housing market that had a negative impact on Renaissance Point. But I think it's doing pretty well now in terms of having some for sale units as well as the rental single family. But financing is always a challenge for developers. And I was just having a discussion about how you can encourage developers to do projects in a given study area by making, the city could set up a loan fund to make low interest loans available to a developer who, say, could acquire, say, 3 lots of 3 totally dilapidated houses. And you could do maybe 5 townhouses on those 3 lots if they rezoned it to accommodate that. And that way you could diversify the housing stock in these neighborhoods and make a product that's more affordable for a lot of people.
And I can't remember if you said it from up here, but in the handout, you talk about critical mass.
Right.
And I just want to, I think I just want to talk about single family homes, but maybe it doesn't matter whether it's that or rental. What's that mean, if you can, if we're saying, hey, we're really talking about infill housing in B and C primarily or mostly, and what's a critical mass? How many units, I don't know if you can answer this, but I'm just curious, how many units, you say to really get the benefit you're looking for, you want to concentrate your efforts in a targeted area and get this, is that
Right.
5 in a 3, I don't know if there's some metric, how do we think about what that means?
Well, yeah, it's definitely focusing on, say, 4 to 6 blocks. If there are, I obviously haven't been here in 3 or 4 years. I drove through these neighborhoods in my Google car, but the Google Maps aren't necessarily up to date, so I don't know whether I'm seeing reality or not. But there are some places where you could definitely do infill. There are several blocks with missing teeth, and you could do infill, and it just filling in those blocks makes a neighborhood feel a lot stronger. And we just finished a similar type study in South Bend, and in one of their neighborhoods they had a lot of vacant corner lots where 2 streets intersected, the corner lots. Most of them had become vacant land, and we suggested that they have developers build small 4-unit rental buildings. People don't want the rental units in the inside of the block. They want that home ownership. But on the corners is a good way to have rental housing for people who want to live in a rental apartment who don't have that. And that can actually add numbers of people. I think ULI has a metric on, if you want retail, you need 1,000 households in a given area. So when you look at your blocks and you see all these dilapidated houses with no one living there, empty lots, if you fill them in, you might not get to 1,000, but you'll do a lot better if you expand the area. And that'll have a much more positive impact. Obviously, if you can acquire enough land to do 5 houses, 5 in a row. A builder trope back in the old days was 3 houses side by side, all with the same plan, but a slight difference in the front facade. And it just was something that would sell immediately. People would just eat them up. And I haven't seen that specifically here. I haven't been on every,
No, we have. Phoenix Place. Remember when that was done, and then the apartments further down Phoenix Manor for seniors. But those 10 houses that were built in Phoenix Place was based on, that concept. We just haven't seen it replicated on any major scale. Everything else that went into
Okay,
Renaissance,
thank you.
You mentioned Renaissance, but everything else that went in there was mostly rental.
yes.
We came in late, and my question is complex.
Uh-oh.
It's about homelessness.
Oh,
My goal personally would be to see the total elimination of homelessness in our city. And I hope everybody would share that ideal. But given what you're talking about, can you say anything about us moving towards that? Do you see any movement toward that ideal so that there is no person that goes without shelter?
it wasn't covered in this study, but I can certainly tell you what other cities have done. And one thing that I find very powerful is acquiring land to do tiny houses. The 250 to 300 square foot houses, they sell them for $20,000. If you can acquire the land, you can put quite a few. Of course, the zoning has to get changed to accommodate that. But that has been done in several cities. Austin, Texas is one of them. Sometimes it's specifically for homeless veterans, but it can be homeless women. It can be anybody. Obviously, in a tiny house, a single or two persons, about the max you can put in there. But it is certainly much less expensive than putting them in hotels. And in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where we did a similar type study to this, where they really did want to address the issue of homelessness, I noticed they had a lot of vacant motels. The motel from the 50s, because there used to be a lot of people who would come and go to the Amish country and stay in these motels, and now they weren't coming anymore. And so we suggested that perhaps the county buy some of these and convert them to housing for homeless people, which they did. So typically there's nothing that covers homelessness in terms of public policy. But those are suggestions that I found very workable to try to accommodate at least single people who are homeless, as opposed to homeless families.
Thank you. And we arrived late. We're going to have to leave early.
Okay.
I see it's being videoed.
Yes.
Where will I be able to see this later? Can anyone tell me?
We'll have it available on the City of Fort Wayne's website.
Very good.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Laurie. Thank you again for coming. Part of what you've done for me is given me a lot of data, and I took notes, obviously, that absolutely, I would think, empower me to sit down and talk. I'm done 9 city councilmen, and I was on city council back in the old 6, actually back in
Yes.
99. But we've had discussion. Paul actually was a planner back then, and we had a 2007 Southeast Development Plan.
That's right.
To talk about housing and commercial development, and we're very aggressive. I think we did a good job on the housing side. We did rather poorly on the business development side. But this seemed like a new day, a new opportunity to get that data, and you can sit down. Last night, Councilwoman Tucker and I were in a meeting, and they were talking about housing development. 200, how many houses? Sharon?
236.
236 in her district, in Sequoia, I believe.
Right.
Is that right?
Just inside the edge of Sequoia.
Paul, is that the one you were talking to me
Yeah,
about?
that's Roosevelt.
Okay. Yeah.
Roosevelt Point, yeah.
Yeah. And the unique thing that came out of that discussion for me last night was residential tip. Something I think the state of Indiana recently approved, and this would be, I believe, the very first residential tip.
That's great. Yep.
For women, that was one of the alternative ways you were probably getting at how to affordability was.
Right, exactly. Yeah, TIF's a good way to approach that. Yes, Monsieur? Yes, go ahead.
Thanks again for coming back to Fort Wayne to participate in this. And you've had such tremendous success, not only here in Fort Wayne, but throughout Northeast Indiana. When you came here in 2006 and started to say people might want to live downtown and people might want to live at the set number of apartments, I think you were really prophetic into that analysis. Looking at this study and looking at the fact that you've got a really great captive audience with 3 current city councilmen and 1 former city councilman, what programs, what initiatives might make the quickest traction from a partnership with city government?
Well, yeah, as we were discussing, one way cities approach is you need to get developers with a strong financial background in doing mixed income housing. And I personally know several. And if you can put together a number of projects in Fort Wayne and throughout the region, we think we have, that could attract one of these developers who are very experienced in doing mixed income housing, which is, it's a skill set that not every developer has. I think that would be a great way to attract new developers here to actually do more of that kind of development, because I don't know of anybody that actually does mixed income here at all. It's either low income or...
How do you make that appealing to a developer in as much as we have had some mixed use development, especially when you get into the inner circle of downtown, but usually that's based on a tax incentive, whether it's the 4% or the 9%. How do you make it attractive in the communities that you've seen use that? What tools were used to make that attractive for them to come together and create that without, because you had mentioned earlier, it wasn't with a tax incentive. How did that become attractive to them?
Well, it usually means that the city has some kind of affordable housing trust fund that they use. And believe me, Baltimore has put together a $50 million affordable housing trust fund. All of them are doing it now. 50 million is huge. If you could come up with 10 million, that's a size comparison there.
Was it all funded by tax dollars or endowed, or how was that?
Each city has their own way of assembling that money. Sometimes they just ask for the kindly donations of the major businesses because a lot of their employees, would be affected by being able to then purchase or rent the housing that would be created with the use of, using that trust fund money for affordable housing. In Baltimore, they took it out of various, which they do in Baltimore. In Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, they actually passed these things called maps, where the people who live in the city actually vote to tax themselves a 1 cent. And it goes for a 5-year period, and it covers a variety of projects. And they're on their 3rd maps. And the first one was to focus on downtown, and that did an amazing job. The second one was to focus on schools. And they built lots of new schools, because it's amazing how much money they were able to get out of that. And the third one has been on seniors housing and senior facilities and recreational facilities for everyone. And so that could easily be, I don't know, nobody in the Midwest wants to have any kind of extra tax, but I think in the end, if it's 1 penny, it mounts up on behalf of the city. So
last question, and then I'm going to turn the floor over. with it, but it's a little outside of the city. It's definitely outside of the city that you've done. But along with the programs that we designed to increase housing stock, were there any programs in the cities that you've seen this be successful that went along with preparing home ownership? Did you see those run simultaneously?
Actually, we've been doing a study in Knoxville, Tennessee. They have gotten a Choice Neighborhood Grant, and those are great because it's the city and the county and the federal government all put up a lot of dollars, and it really can have a huge impact. And it generally has as a focus some kind of a public housing property that's in disrepair, serious bad shape, and then they do a whole neighborhood around it. So obviously if you could do that, that's very helpful. But in Knoxville, Tennessee, they use Section 8 dollars that someone gets X amount of dollars, Section 8, and they train that person, that household, on home ownership, and they use what that dollar amount can purchase in terms of a mortgage. The county authority then lends them the down payment, and they, using their Section 8 money, pay the mortgage. I thought that was a brilliant way of taking something that's normally thought of as a rental.
We know that we were in a Planet Allen yesterday meeting, and we know that we are missing in the community like some 2,100 houses, both affordable and mixed use. We know that the houses that currently exist are some of them built all the way back to the 20s, and landlords have not made any improvements into those houses. So do we have the option to not do anything, to not provide additional new stuff?
If you don't do anything, those neighborhoods are just going to keep going down.
Okay.
And you don't want to lose your city.
And that's the thing that I like to draw the attention to many people, both developers, to people who live in the community, to people who want to invest in the community, that in order to not allow it to turn into a slum or to turn into a ghetto, we have to invest into the community. And sometimes investment brings growth, right? And growth isn't liked by everybody. But the option is to not invest, which allows it to decline even worse than it is, or to invest.
Right.
Okay.
And I don't think the issue is so much growth as change. People get very, I understand that. I remember when I first came to Fort Wayne, I was driving along Jefferson, I'm getting into downtown, there's a gas station. Oh, a gas station in downtown. Oh, that's terrible. What a use. And so I'm thinking, terrible, until I got this place, apartment, and there was a lovely gas station on the corner, and I used it all the time. And all of a sudden, it closed, and I was really upset. So I felt very badly about having dissed that gas station, because I knew lots of people loved that gas station. You learn a lot over the years. So it's very important to make sure you've got all the services, and as long as we have cars, you need gas stations. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I just want to make sure that we continue to keep focused on that, because
right.
We've seen what years of disinvestment has currently bought us.
Right.
And we continue to go down the path of not investing and not having developers or people interested in turning the city or Southeast around. It will not stay the same way. It will get worse. So we want to make sure that we're creating safe houses, safe neighborhoods, clean houses, and new options for people to be able to live in.
And the worse it gets, the harder and more expensive it is to bring back. So you want to catch it.
A couple more questions.
Okay, I just want to say thank you. The data you provided is very helpful.
Oh.
I'm from the Southeast, but
good.
I am an investor and a developer.
Oh, good. Yay.
I have partnered with a developer who focuses primarily on the mixed-use development.
Did I talk to you on the phone?
We didn't get to
Oh.
They pointed me to you. and
Oh,
we never connected.
we never connected,
Right,
okay.
so I just wanted to make a statement. The biggest thing I took away from this as a prior resident of the Southeast, a community advocate of the Southeast, and soon to be developer for the Southeast, I hope. So the biggest thing you made the statement of is the diversification you need to see in the development.
Right.
Southeast is not a one-shoe-fits-all for development, for the people, for the community, for anything.
Right.
And I would like to see that idea bought into more across the board, whether it's city development. Not saying that it hasn't, but the people, the community, I explained it to city council. In the community, I explained it to Fort Wayne City. Everyone needs to understand that it is not going to be, let's go put these huge condos in the Southeast and expect it to work out. Whether it's for the developer, the builder, the community, for
Right.
everyone. Because you put a project like that could be good in an area and it does not work out, then the community like, oh, nobody wants to go
Right.
there and invest.
No,
in
you
it.
have to make sure
We
there's a
have to
plan, yes.
diversify. So that means when we're looking, when we're all sitting down, working together, community, council, city, developers, we need to keep that in mind, that no, we can't just do maybe affordable housing, we can't just do market rate, but then we also have to get creative. We have to realize that, but wait, Southeast falls into that affordable market, affordable housing at the higher income in those levels. We have to look at the income levels and to benefit, how we can benefit that lower income housing possibly, and how we can use creative financial tactics to meet that, so we're not gentrifying, we're not displacing people, because where are we gonna put them?
Right.
We can't keep them on the Southeast, we're gonna put them somewhere else, so now we're losing our diversity,
Yeah.
we're losing our community.
Right.
You live on the Southeast, you know what you get there, you know all of the excitement, the family feel community. Even people who aren't from there might not understand that, but you know, I want my mom to feel comfortable to live on the Southeast. I want my family, friends,
Right.
people I go hang out with. You know, I want people to realize that development and investment into a city does not have to be gentrification all the time.
That's true.
It has to be diverse, and it's just a matter of having the right people at the table. So
Do we have time for one more?
I hope that touches all bases.
Okay.
This isn't really a question, it's more of a comment for the people who are in the room. The deterioration around the core of downtown is due to development standards and the setbacks. The minimum lot sizes, the minimum dwelling sizes are a de facto prohibition on infill development in these areas. And until our legislators have the political will to eliminate discrimination through zoning, nothing's going to change.
And that's a very good point. A lot of the discrimination in this country was thanks to our zoning policies. So we have to be very careful when we change zoning, what we do.